He reached for a tunic of coarse dun-colored wool that hung from a peg near the bed and pulled it over his head, the garment still slightly damp from the previous day's patrol, smelling of wet sheep and wood smoke. Over that, he drew a thicker over-tunic and then a hooded cloak of dark russet wool, its hem heavy with old mud that had dried to a crust and been rubbed away in patches. The cloak was lined with rough linen and had a leather cord at the neck pulled tight against the chill. He sat on a stool to wind woolen leg wraps around his lower legs, crossing the strips carefully over his brays and tying them at the knee, then pushed his feet into tall boots of softened cowhide that reached nearly to his knee, the soles worn smooth from countless miles of walking and riding through leaf litter and mud. The single room of the lodge held a hearth of river stones set into the middle of the earth floor, its low fire banked the night before with ash and a thick log of hornbeam that now glowed faintly with a few orange embers. The Verderer knelt, took a handful of dry straw from a basket, and placed it gently on the embers, blowing until a small flame caught and licked up around the edges of the straw. He added a few split sticks of hazel and a chunk of dry oak, waiting until the fire was steady before he filled a small iron pot with water from a wooden bucket and set it on a trivet over the flames to warm. The bucket water was cold from the well outside, carrying the taste of chalk and the faint scent of wet leaves that had fallen into it the day before. He moved slowly, without haste, as if the morning itself required a particular pace set by the rain and the grey sky. Breakfast was a bowl of plain porridge made from coarsely ground oats that had been stored in a lidded crock away from the damp. He poured hot water from the pot over a generous handful of the oats, stirred the mixture with a horn spoon until it thickened into a greyish paste, and ate it standing by the hearth, looking out through the half-open door at the steady drizzle that fell straight down in the windless air. The porridge had no salt, no honey, only the bland earthy taste of the grain itself, and he ate it slowly, the horn spoon scraping against the wooden bowl with a soft, regular sound. When he finished, he rinsed the bowl in the bucket and set it upside down on a shelf beside the single wax tablet that waited for the day's work. That wax tablet was a pair of small rectangular boards of dark beech wood, hinged with leather straps, each board hollowed out to hold a smooth layer of beeswax darkened with soot. The wax was soft enough to take the impression of a stylus, but firm enough to hold the marks through a long day's ride. Beside it lay the bone stylus itself, a hand's length of polished cattle bone with a sharpened point at one end for writing and a flat spatulate knob at the other for smoothing the wax to erase old marks. He checked that the wax was even, pressed a thumb into a corner to test its give, then closed the tablet and tucked it into the leather pouch that hung from his belt along with a notched measuring stick of ash wood the length of his forearm. The stick was marked with a series of shallow cuts that indicated standard measurements of deer hoofprints, a quick gauge to compare track size without counting finger widths each time. He also placed a small linen sack of oats for the horse into the pouch, a fire striker of iron and a piece of flint wrapped in a scrap of leather, and a strip of dried venison folded into a clean cloth in case he needed food later in the day. He lifted the heavy door latch, a bar of blackened iron that moved smoothly in its socket, and stepped outside into the wet morning. The yard of the lodge was a small clearing of packed mud and scattered straw, bordered by a low wattle fence on one side and the dark tree line of the royal forest on the other. Rain fell as it had all night, not a driving storm, but a patient drizzle that filled the air with a fine grey mist and beaded on every surface. The Verderer pulled his hood forward until the edge of the wool framed his face like a cowl, the rain pattering softly on the fabric with a sound like fingers brushing coarse cloth. Water ran in thin rivulets from the edge of the thatch and pooled in the hollows of the yard, each puddle reflecting the pale grey of the sky so that the ground seemed littered with pieces of cloud. He walked to the stable lean-to built against the side of the lodge, its open front facing away from the prevailing wind. Inside stood the bay gelding, a calm horse of middle years with a deep chestnut-brown coat that darkened to nearly black at its lower legs. The horse was already awake, turning its large head to look at the Verderer with dark liquid eyes, its breath steaming gently from wide nostrils. The man ran a hand along the horse's neck, feeling the coarse texture of the winter coat beginning to come in thick under the short summer hairs, then moved to the manger to check that a small amount of hay remained from the night. He refilled the hay net from a bale stored in the back of the lean-to and added a measure of oats from the sack, the grains rattling into the wooden feed box with a sound like falling gravel. The saddle was a simple wooden tree affair covered in darkened leather, resting on a rack beside the stall, and the verderer lifted it carefully, settling the padded panel onto the horse's back just behind the withers and smoothing the blanket beneath, so that no fold would cause a rub during the long hours ahead. He tightened the girth slowly, one strap at a time, checking that the tension was even and the horse stood perfectly still, one hind hoof cocked in relaxation. The bridle came next, the bit slipped gently between the teeth as the horse accepted it with a slight champ of its jaw, and the reins of braided leather lay wet and cool against the animal's neck. The verderer checked each strap and buckle with the unhurried patience of long practice, running his thumb along the leather for any hidden crack or weakness, finding none. His own legs were muddy to the knee within the first minutes outside, the wet soil of the yard clinging to his boots and spattering up the woolen wraps. He led the horse out of the lean-to into the yard, where the rain immediately began to darken the saddle leather with tiny spreading spots. The horse shook its head once, a gentle motion that made the metal rings of the bridle chink together with a soft sound, but otherwise it stood quietly, its ears moving slowly forward and back as it listened to the forest sounds. The verderer placed a foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle, the leather creaking as his weight settled into it, and from that higher vantage he could see over the wattle fence to the first line of trees that marked the edge of the royal forest of Waltham. They rose like a dark wall of oak and hornbeam, their wet trunks nearly black against the grey mist, their upper branches fading into the low cloud that sat upon the land. He turned the horse toward the track that led from the lodge into the wood, a narrow way of churned mud and exposed roots that glistened with water. The horse walked at a slow, steady pace, its hooves making a deep sucking sound each time they lifted from the mud, and the verderer let the animal choose its own path around the worst of the puddles. Rain dripped from the edge of his hood and ran in an occasional bead down the bridge of his nose, which he wiped away with the back of a glove made of heavy leather, now dark with moisture. The forest approached and then enclosed them, the trees pressing closer on either side, until the lodge yard behind was completely hidden by a screen of holly bushes with leaves of deep waxy green, each one edged with sharp points that held tiny spheres of water trembling with the vibration of the horse's passing. The sounds altered as they entered the wood. The rain no longer fell directly onto open ground, but struck the canopy high above in a million-minute impacts, a constant gentle hiss, like the sea heard from a great distance. Water gathered on the broad leaves of the oaks and then fell in larger, heavier drops to the lower branches, then to the leaf litter below, creating a layered rhythm of soft pattering and the occasional louder splash when a gathered weight of water fell from a holly leaf onto a protruding root. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, a rich dark scent that seemed to rise with every step the horse took into the softened ground. Ferns growing along the track brushed against the verderer's leg, leaving streaks of cold water on the wool of his wrap, and he shifted slightly in the saddle to avoid a low-hanging branch of hornbeam that trailed finger-like twigs across the path. He passed a boundary marker, a stone set upright in the earth with a cross carved into its granite face, its surface pitted by years of weather and dark with moss that grew in the grooves of the carving. This stone was one of the markers that defined the outer limit of the royal forest, and the verderer noted its position without stopping, his eyes moving over the familiar shape and then on to the next landmark. Just beyond the stone, a pollarded oak stood at the edge of the track, its trunk cut back many years before to produce a thick knob of wood from which sprouted a cluster of thin, straight branches now bare of leaves except for a few brown tatters that still clung to the twigs. Rain ran in vertical lines down the grey bark, collecting in the hollows where old branches had been removed, and each hollow held a tiny dark pool that reflected nothing at all, only sitting there as still as the air itself. The track descended slightly into a shallow dip, where the water had collected to form a wide puddle that stretched across the entire width of the path. The horse stopped and lowered its head to sniff at the water before stepping carefully through, the surface breaking into ripples that spread outward in perfect circles and vanished into the brown opacity. On the far side the mud was deeper, and the verderer felt the slight shift of the horse's balance as it adjusted to the uncertain footing. its neck lowering and lengthening with a smooth, fluid motion. He patted its shoulder once, a brief touch of gloved hand to wet coat, and they continued into the deeper wood, where the light was even greyer, and the shapes of individual trees began to blur together in the mist. A wood pigeon called from somewhere out of sight, its soft cooing repeated 5 times before it fell silent, and the verderer listened to the absence of sound that followed, noting that the birds were quiet this morning, probably sheltering deep in the ivy that covered some of the older oaks. The horse's ears swiveled at the pigeon's call, but then returned to their lazy forward position, and the steady rhythm of its walk continued, a soft full-beat pattern of hoof on earth that merged with the hiss and drip of the rain into a single continuous sound, almost like the breathing of the forest itself. The verderer sat deep in the saddle, his spine straight but relaxed, his eyes moving slowly from the ground to the middle distance and back again, cataloguing the condition of the track, the height of the water in the ditches on either side, the presence or absence of fresh deer tracks in the soft mud beside the puddles. He saw a single print as they passed a place where a badger had dug a small scrape in the bank, the cloven shape of a fallow deer hoof pressed clearly into a patch of silt washed down from the higher ground. He did not stop to measure it. This was only the first, and there would be many more deeper in the forest. He filed the location away in his mind, a point along the familiar mental map he carried of every tree, every ditch, every clearing in this part of the royal forest. The horse walked on, and the track curved west around a massive fallen beech whose roots had pulled up a wall of earth taller than a man, the tangle of soil and rootlets now streaming with water that dripped from every fibre. A small stream had formed at the base of the root plate, carving a channel through the leaf litter before disappearing under a carpet of wet moss. The verderer leaned forward slightly to guide the horse around the obstacle, and then they were past it, and the fallen tree was behind them, slowly being reclaimed by the wet and the rot and the endless patient work of the autumn rain. The track began to climb gently toward a rise where the trees thinned and a grey sky opened overhead, though the rain continued without change. At the top of the rise stood another boundary stone, smaller and older, tilted at an angle where frost had heaved the ground beneath it, and the verderer reined the horse to a halt beside it. This was the true edge of the forest, the legal boundary beyond which the verderer's authority gave way to the common fields and the village grazing land. He sat there for a moment, looking out over the muted landscape of bare hedgerows and distant strips of brown ploughland, all softened by the mist and the rain into a single wash of grey and ochre. Then he turned the horse back toward the forest, and they passed the stone on the other side, moving from the open into the enclosure of the trees once more, the sounds of the wood closing about them like a heavy curtain drawn across a doorway. The day's patrol had begun, and the verderer rode on into the wet autumn, his horse's hooves squelching softly, his wax tablet waiting in its pouch, and the forest stretching ahead in an endless series of damp trunks and dripping leaves that held no urgency and no alarm. The verderer rode on into the thickening wood, the horse still walking at that same slow and steady pace it had kept since leaving the lodge yard, its hooves pressing deep impressions into the mud of the track. The low cloud that had sat upon the land all morning showed no sign of lifting, and the light that filtered through the bare branches overhead was a diffused silver grey that made every surface look wet and soft. Behind them, the open fields had vanished entirely, replaced on all sides by the close press of trees, the royal forest of Waltham closing about horse and rider like a door swung silently shut. The verderer had ridden this track more times than he could count, in every season and every weather, and he knew its landmarks the way a man knows the grain of his own table, but he still paid it the full attention his office required, his eyes moving slowly from the path to the trees to the ditches on either side as the horse walked deeper into the October morning. The woodland here was a mosaic of different species, all mingled together without pattern, the dark columnar trunks of oak rising among the pale grey bark of hornbeam and the twisting shapes of field maple. Holly bushes grew in dense understory thickets, their spiny leaves the only real green left in the canopy, now that the broadleaves had turned and fallen, and blackthorn sent out spiky tangles of bare dark twigs that reached across the path at the height of a man's shoulder. Every branch, every twig, every trunk was saturated with water, glistening darkly in the faint light, and the rain continued to fall not as separate drops, but as a fine, steady mist that moved through the trees as much as it fell from the sky, drifting in slow curtains that opened and closed around the Verderer as he rode. The horse's bay coat had darkened to the color of damp bark, its mane plastered in a single rope-like strand along the curve of its neck, and the leather of the saddle had grown slick and dark with the moisture that seeped into every fiber. On the left of the track, the Verderer noted a line of pollarded oaks that stretched away into the mist, each tree cut back long ago to create a living fence of thick, bold trunks topped with a spray of thin young branches. The pollards marked the inner boundary of a particular section of the forest, a division that existed not as a wall but as a legal line known to the Verderer, the foresters, and the men who had the right to collect wood in this quarter. The bark of these trees was deeply furrowed and dark with rain, each crevice running with water that traced slow vertical lines down to the moss that grew in thick pads at the base of every trunk. The Verderer counted them as he passed, a silent tally kept in his head, and he saw that the third tree from the corner had a broken limb hanging by a strip of bark, something he would need to report when he returned to the lodge. The dead limb swung slightly in no wind at all, moved only by the accumulated weight of water that dripped from its splintered end with a constant pulse. Beyond the line of pollards, the ground fell away in a long, gentle slope that had been cut centuries before into a ditch and bank, an earthwork known as the Pale that marked the internal division between the royal demesne and the outer woodlands nearer the village. The ditch was deep and now half full of brown water that reflected the grey sky with such perfect stillness that it looked like a strip of polished metal laid along the bottom of the hollow. The bank on the far side rose steeply and was covered with old hornbeam stools, the multiple trunks leaning outward at angles that spoke of centuries of coppicing. The Verderer reined the horse to a halt, and sat for a moment looking down into the ditch, watching the way the rainwater collected on the surface and the way a single yellow leaf, fallen from some distant sycamore, drifted slowly across the reflection on a current too gentle to see. A water beetle pushed itself from the mud at the bottom and rose through the brown water with a sudden silver bubble trailing behind it, and the ripples spread outward in a perfect ring that faded before it reached the bank. The horse lowered its head and blew softly through its nostrils at the water, then straightened and stood patient as the Verderer gathered up the reins again and moved on. The track led them away from the ditch and deeper into a stand of hornbeam, the trees here vast and old with trunks that divided low into wide-spreading crowns. Their bark was smooth in places and deeply ridged in others, a mottled grey-green that seemed almost to glow in the wet air. Fallen leaves of hornbeam lay on the path in drifts of pale brown and faded gold, each one oval and finely toothed, limp and darkening at the edges where the rain had begun to break them down. The horse's hooves pressed through these layers with a soft, wet tearing sound, and the Verderer could see in the deeper hoofprints how the leaf pulp had been mixed with the grey silt of the underlying clay, forming a paste that clung to the horse's fetlocks. He shifted in the saddle and looked back at the print they had left, a perfect dark shape in the carpet of leaves that was already filling with water and would, within the hour, be indistinguishable from any other puddle on the track. Ahead the path began to rise almost imperceptibly, and the hornbeam gave way to a mixed stand of oak and holly where the ground was firmer underfoot. Here the Verderer noticed the first deliberate marker of the royal forest's outer boundary, a low wooden gate set between two ancient oaks whose trunks were so wide the two men together could not have touched hands around them. The gate was made of rough split oak boards, greyed with age, and held together by 3 horizontal rails, the whole thing hinged with broad straps of black leather that had been greased against the wet, but now glistened with droplets of water. A simple latch of carved wood held the gate closed, and a ditch on either side prevented any easy passing around it. The Verderer had opened this gate many hundreds of times, and he did so now with the same deliberate care as always. He dismounted by swinging his right leg over the horse's hindquarters and dropping lightly onto the wet track, the mud sucking at his boots with a soft sound. The horse stood ground-tied by training, not moving as the rein was looped over its head and left to hang. The Verderer walked to the gate and placed his hand on the latch, feeling the wet wood cold and rough under his glove. He lifted the carved peg from its socket, the wood swollen with moisture so that it resisted slightly before coming free with a grunt of effort. and then he pushed the gate open, the leather hinges creaking in a long, slow note that was the only sound besides the rain. The gate swung inward over a patch of flattened grass that had grown long and pale in the shade of the 2 oaks, and the verderer held it wide while he returned to the horse, took up the rein, and led the animal through the gap with a gentle click of his tongue. The horse stepped carefully over the threshold, as if aware of the change from outer wood to inner forest. Its ears pricked forward and then relaxing as the verderer let the gate swing shut behind them. He fitted the latch back into its socket with a solid thump, checked that the gate sat square, and then remounted using the same smooth motion as before, the saddle leather groaning softly under his weight. Now they were truly inside the royal forest, and the character of the woodland changed again. The undergrowth here was less dense, the larger trees having shaded out the bramble and bracken that tangled the outer tracks, and the floor of the forest was a deep bed of leaf litter that had accumulated over many autumns until it lay thick and soft as a mattress. The verderer's horse walked on this carpet almost silently, the sound of its hooves reduced to a muffled crumpling rather than the squelching of the outer mud. Rain continued to fall through the high canopy, but here it arrived as a fine spray rather than distinct drops, having been broken and dispersed by the network of twigs and buds that formed the roof of the wood. The air was cool and very still, and the smell of the place was something the verderer knew as well as his own skin. The deep, rich odor of decaying oak leaves, the fungal scent of woodrot, the clean, sharp note of wet moss, and underneath it, all the dark, mineral smell of the forest soil itself, which was never quite dry even in high summer, and now in October was saturated with the water that had been falling without pause since the equinox. The verderer guided the horse along the continuation of the track, which was fainter here and marked only by the absence of saplings and the visible line of bare earth that showed where many hooves had passed over many years. He watched the ground with the particular attention of his calling, noting the places where a deer had crossed the path since the last rain, its cloven hoofprints still fresh and sharp in a patch of silt washed down from a bank. He did not stop for these, they were common signs, and he would begin his systematic tracking later, in the deeper parts of the forest where the herds gathered. For now, he was simply moving inward, absorbing the state of the woodland, letting the quiet rhythm of the ride settle into his bones as the grey light grew slowly brighter, with the hidden sun climbing unseen above the cloud layer. The trees here were older, much older, than those near the village. Massive oaks with trunks 6 feet across rose straight for 30 feet before their first branches, their bark deeply fissured into vertical plates that ran with dark lines of rainwater. Each tree was a small world of its own, the crevices in the bark hosting tiny ferns and cushions of moss that glowed vivid green against the dark grey of the trunk. Higher up, where the branches divided and spread, the tree held its own store of collected debris, fallen leaves from seasons past, twigs brought by birds, the decayed remains of old nests, all of it forming a dark loam that fed the ivy that climbed some of the trunks in thick woody ropes. The ivy leaves were broad and dark, each one holding a perfect trembling bead of water at its lowest point, and when a drop finally fell, it made a small distinct sound on the leaves below that, carried through the quiet of the forest. The verderer passed an ancient yew that grew at a bend in the path, its trunk a mass of twisted red-brown wood that seemed to have flowed rather than grown, its branches spreading wide and low to the ground where they had rooted themselves, creating a circle of subsidiary trunks around the parent tree. The yew was older than the forest law, older than the village, older perhaps than the memory of man, and it exuded a dark stillness that the verderer always noted with a slight inclination of his head as he passed, a habit he could not have explained. Rain dripped from the yew's needles in a constant slow percussion, and the ground beneath it was bare of any other growth, a circle of dark needle litter that held the shape of the tree's shadow even without sun. As he rode deeper, the mist that had been a general greyness in the air began to gather in visible banks that drifted between the trees, forming soft shifting walls that opened to reveal new vistas of woodland and then closed again, hiding the path ahead in a white opacity that smelled of wet air and the faint mineral tang of water vapor. The horse moved through these drifts of mist with its ears forward untroubled, and the verderer could feel the moisture beading on his eyebrows and the front of his hood, the wool of the cloak growing heavier as it absorbed the ambient wet. His gloves were soaked through now, the leather dark and the inner linen lining clammy against his fingers, but he made no move to wring them out. Wetness was simply the condition of October, and resisting it was a thing that men who worked indoors might attempt. The verderer accepted it, the same way the trees accepted it, standing immobile and patient while the water ran down their trunks and into the earth. The track brought them at last to a small natural clearing where a stream crossed the path, the same Hart's brook that ran through the southern quarter of the forest, though here it was narrower and faster, tumbling over a bed of rounded stones and gravel that clattered softly as the water pushed against them. The verderer let the horse stop to drink, dropping its muzzle into the cold brown flow and drawing up long draughts while the water streamed from its lips back into the brook. He watched the water running over the stones and noted the slight milky color that meant higher ground upstream was shedding its clay into the current, a detail he filed away for later consideration when he came to check the deer wallows. Fallen leaves of alder and willow sailed past on the surface, spinning slowly in the eddies, and a branch of dead oak, barkless and silvered, lay wedged between two stones where it had been caught by the recent high water from a storm now 5 days past. When the horse had drunk its fill, the verderer turned its head gently away and allowed it to pick its own way across the ford, the water rising no higher than the horse's knees and splashing with a cold, clear sound. On the far bank, the track resumed, climbing a short incline between stands of coppiced hazel, whose cut-stool sent up dozens of straight rods, each as thick as a thumb at the base. The rods were bare of leaves, but a few catkins hung from their tips, pale yellow-green and swollen with water. The verderer brushed one with his leg as they passed, and a shower of cold drops fell onto the horse's flank, making it twitch its skin once, and then continue without breaking stride. Up the slope the forest opened slightly, and the verderer could see for a fair distance through the grey mist between the trunks. The view was all in tones of brown and grey, the dark vertical lines of the trees repeating into the fog until they lost definition and became a soft blur, a wall of dim shapes that merged with the sky. The horizon was invisible. There was only the near and the near distant, the wood that was close enough to touch and the wood that was only a suggestion, and the endless sound of water moving slowly through 100,000 branches, 100 million leaves already fallen and lying in drifts that steamed faintly in the chill. The earthy smell of the leaf litter rose from the ground with every step of the horse, a rich and heavy scent that was the signature of autumn in this forest, and the verderer breathed it in as calmly as a man sitting by his own hearth. He was deep inside the royal forest now, surrounded on all sides by the work of his office, and the morning stretched before him as slowly and as gently as the mist itself. The verderer rode on through the grey light of the mid-morning, the horse still walking with the same patient rhythm it had held since the ford, its hooves making almost no sound on the deep leaf litter that covered the forest floor. The mist had thinned slightly as they climbed the gentle slope beyond the hazel coppice, but it still hung in rags among the higher branches, drifting slowly between the trunks of the ancient oaks like smoke that never rose. The rain had softened to a fine mizzle that seemed to float rather than fall, a wetness that hung in the air and settled on every surface without any visible drops, and the verderer could feel the damp working its way through the wool of his cloak and tunic, a slow, persistent cold that was so familiar he no longer noticed it except as a background condition of his day. He turned his head slowly from left to right, scanning the ground on either side of the faint track, his eyes moving in a steady pattern that covered every patch of bare soil, every muddy hollow, every place where an animal might have left its mark. Ahead the woodland began to open slightly, the oaks giving way to a stretch of more scattered trees with wide gaps between them where the bracken had died back and lay now as a flat carpet of rust-brown fronds, beaten down by the rain and beginning to rot into the earth. Here the ground was softer, less covered by leaf litter and more exposed to the sky, and a series of shallow natural hollows had formed where water collected after every rain. The verderer guided the horse toward one of these hollows, a slight depression in the earth no wider than a cart, its bottom covered with a thin film of standing water that reflected the grey clouds with a dull pewter sheen. At the edge of the water, where the mud was darker, and the silt had been washed smooth by the overflow of previous days, he saw it. He saw the hoofprint of a fallow deer. The verderer stopped the horse with a gentle pressure of his knees and a slight shift of his weight backward, a signal so subtle that the animal responded instantly, halting in place and standing motionless as if carved from the same dark wood as the trees around it. He leaned forward in the saddle to look more closely at the ground, his hood falling forward around his face and framing the view of the print as if he were peering through a narrow window. The track was pressed deep into the soft silt at the margin of the puddle, and its edges were crisp and sharp, not yet blurred by the rain or the slow seepage of water into the surrounding clay. This was a fresh track, made within the last hour, perhaps within the last minutes, and the Verderer studied it for a long moment from the saddle, noting its position relative to the water's edge, and the direction the cloven toes were pointing, which was eastward toward the deeper wood. He dismounted with care, swinging his leg over the saddle and dropping to the ground with a soft, wet thud, his boots pressing into the mud and making their own prints alongside the deer track, though his were larger and less delicate. He looped the reins loosely around a low branch of a nearby holly, the leather dark and slippery against the wood, and the horse stood at ease, lowering its head to nose at a patch of wet grass that grew at the base of the tree. The Verderer knelt down in the mud, without any thought for the state of his leggings, which were already wet through, and he brought his face close to the track, close enough that he could see the individual grains of silt that had been pushed up by the deer's hoof as it pressed into the soft earth. The print was a perfect cloven shape, two narrow-pointed toes splayed slightly apart with a deeper impression at the front where the animal's weight had been concentrated as it stepped forward. Fallow deer left a print that was narrower and more elegant than the splayed track of a red deer, with toes that came together in a sharp point at the front and a rounded heel at the back, and the Verderer recognized this as the track of a doe, judging by the size and the delicacy of the impression. The toes were each about as long as his thumb from the knuckle to the tip, and the gap between them was narrow, the mark of an animal that walked with a light step, placing each foot carefully. He could see the faint ridges in the mud where the edges of the hoof wall had pressed, and even the tiny mark of the dew claws of the back, two small dots that only showed when the ground was truly soft. He reached to his belt and unclasped the leather pouch, drawing out the notched measuring stick of ash wood. The stick was smooth and darkened along its length from the oils of his hand, each notch cut with care and numbered in his own memory, though no digits were carved into the wood. He laid the stick gently across the print, aligning the end with the rear edge of the heel, and he read the length against the notches, noting that the track measured just over 3 notches long, a measurement that matched an adult doe in good condition. He then turned the stick crossways and measured the width across the 2 toes at their widest point, finding it to be slightly less than 2 notches, again consistent with a female fallow deer of medium size. The depth of the impression was harder to measure with the stick, so he used his finger instead, pressing a gloved tip into the mud beside the track and comparing the resistance with the depression left by the hoof, estimating that the deer had sunk into the soft silt by perhaps the thickness of a finger joint, which told him the animal was moving slowly and putting its full weight on each step, not bounding or fleeing. The edges of the print were as sharp as if they had been cut by a knife. No water had seeped into the bottom of the track yet, and the tiny ridges of mud between the toe impressions were still standing, not yet collapsed or washed away. The Verderer knew from experience that a print like this, in ground this soft, would begin to lose its definition within half an hour of the animal passing, first at the edges and then in the deeper hollows, as the water slowly filled the depression and the silt settled back into place. A print that was this fresh meant the deer was near, perhaps just beyond the next thicket, but he was not here to pursue or to disturb the king's animals. He was here to record, to count, to note the movements and the numbers of the herds that roamed the royal forest. He stayed where he was, kneeling in the mud, and he let the deer go on its way unalarmed. He sat back on his heels and reached into the pouch again, this time drawing out the hinged wax tablet and the bone stylus. The tablet was cool and slightly tacky to the touch, the beeswax darkened with soot to a deep brown black that showed every scratch with perfect clarity. He opened it carefully, the leather hinges soft with age and moisture, and he balanced the open tablet on his knee while he took the stylus in his right hand. The pointed end was sharp and smooth, worn to a perfect angle by years of use, and he first turned the stylus around and used the flat spatulate end to smooth a small area of the wax, pressing down gently and drawing the warm wax across the surface to erase previous marks and create a clean space for new writing. The wax gave slightly under the pressure, yielding a faint scent of honey and soot that mingled with the earthy smell of the mud. He began to write, pressing the sharp point into the wax with a light but deliberate touch. He did not write words. The Verderer used a system of marks that had been taught to him by his predecessor, a set of simple signs and tallies that could be read quickly and took up little space on the tablet. For a fallow dough track, he scratched a single curved line with a small loop at one end, a shape like a shepherd's crook, and beside it he added a short horizontal mark that indicated the freshness of the print. The sharper the angle of the line, the more recent the track. He then scratched a numeral for the count, a simple vertical stroke for this single animal, though if there had been more, he would have added more strokes. Below this, he added a mark that indicated the location, a rune-like sign that represented the clearing with the hollow, a circle with a line through it that stood for water and open ground together. The whole record took no more than a few seconds to write, and he sat back and examined it to be sure the wax had taken the marks cleanly. Then he turned the tablet over and checked the other side, which was already filling with the notes he had made earlier in the morning, the tally of the pollards, and the mark for the fallen branch. The cold of the ground had begun to seep through the knees of his leggings, and he stood up slowly, his back straightening with a faint creak that came as much from the damp as from the effort of kneeling. He closed the tablet with care, making sure the wax surfaces did not touch, and he tucked it back into the pouch along with the stylus and the notched stick, drawing the leather flap down and securing it with the bone toggle. The horse had not moved from where he had left it, though it had lifted its head and was now looking toward the east with its ears pricked forward, perhaps hearing or scenting the same deer whose track the Verderer had just recorded. The man ran a wet glove along the horse's neck, a brief touch of reassurance, and then he untied the rein and gathered it into his hand. He walked a few paces away from the hollow, leading the horse, and he scanned the ground for more tracks, finding them almost at once. The doe had crossed the clearing in a slow diagonal line, its hoofprints spaced evenly about a stride apart, and the Verderer followed these tracks for a short distance on foot, noting that the deer had stopped once to browse on a low branch of a holly, the twig ends bitten cleanly, and the bark stripped in a small patch. Droppings lay near the browse mark, small dark pellets of clumped fibre that were still soft and glistening with moisture, yet more evidence that the animal had passed this way very recently. He made no mark for these additional signs. The original record was sufficient, and the tablet had no room for every detail. He simply noted them in his memory, adding them to the vast store of knowledge he carried about the deer of this forest, their habits and their favoured paths, their feeding grounds and their shelter trees. He remounted the horse with a smooth motion, the saddle leather groaning softly as his weight settled into the familiar hollow formed by years of riding. From the saddle, he could see the whole clearing laid out before him, the pattern of track and puddle and fallen bracken, and he let the horse walk forward at its own pace, following the line of the doe's prints for a way until they veered off into a thicket of blackthorn and disappeared among the tangled bare branches. He did not follow. He turned the horse back to the faint track that led through the clearing and continued on his patrol, his eyes moving again to the ground, scanning for the next mark, the next hollow, the next patch of soft silt where a recent passing might be read. The rain began to fall more heavily as he left the clearing, the fine mizzle thickening into a proper shower that pattered on the hood of his cloak and sent small splashes leaping from the surface of the puddles. The horse shook its head, rattling the bridle rings, and the Verderer pulled his hood a little further forward, the water running in a steady drip from its edge and falling onto the saddle before running off again. The sound of the rain was louder now, a steady hiss that filled the wood and merged with the distant rushing of the swollen brook, and the Verderer rode on through it, his mind already moving ahead to the next landmark on his long, slow circuit of the royal forest. The Verderer guided the horse away from the clearing where the doe's track had been recorded, and toward the sound of running water that had been a constant undertone beneath the rain since they left the higher ground. The faint path he followed now ran almost parallel to Hart's Brook, though the stream itself remained hidden behind a screen of alder and willow whose bare branches wove together in a damp lattice that held droplets of water trembling on every twig. The sound of the brook grew louder as the horse descended a gentle slope, the soft crumpling of hooves on wet leaves giving way to a more distinct splashing noise, the rush of water pouring over stone and root with a steady continuous voice that filled the air and muted even the hiss of the rain. The Verderer knew this stretch of the brook well, every deep pool and shallow riffle, every fallen tree that had lain across the current for years, and he noted as he approached that the water was running higher and faster than it had been on his last patrol a week before, the color a cloudy brown that spoke of rain upstream, washing soil from the banks. The track emerged from the alder thicket onto the stony margin of the brook, and the Verderer reined the horse to a halt at the water's edge. Here the stream was perhaps 15 feet across, though in summer it shrank to half that width, leaving dry shelves of cracked mud and bleached stones on either side. Now those shelves were entirely submerged, the water lapping against the tangled roots of the bank and swirling around the trunks of the alders that grew right at the edge, their bark darkened to black where the flood had risen and then slowly receded over the past days. The surface of the brook was broken by 100 small waves that rose and fell without pattern, each one catching the grey light and flashing dully for a moment, before collapsing into the general flow. In the middle of the channel, a large stone, split in half by some ancient frost, divided the current into 2 strands that rushed around it with a constant foaming gurgle, the white bubbles gathering in a mat that circled in an eddy on the downstream side before breaking apart and continuing toward the distant river Lear. The horse, seeing and smelling the water, lowered its head and stretched its neck toward the brook, the rein sliding through the Verderer's fingers as he let the animal take its own pace. The gelding stepped forward delicately over the round stones of the bank, each hoof placed with care among the loose gravel that shifted and clattered under its weight, and then it dropped its muzzle into the cold brown flow and began to drink. The Verderer sat relaxed in the saddle, letting the horse drink its fill, and he listened to the sound of the water and watched the surface for any sign of fish or otter or the quick darting flash of a kingfisher, though none appeared. The rain continued to fall on his hood and on the horse's back and on the surface of the brook, each drop striking the water and creating a tiny circular ripple that was instantly swept away by the current, as if the rain were being erased as soon as it touched the stream. Downstream, at a bend where the brook widened into a shallow pool overhung by a leaning willow, a movement caught the Verderer's eye. A grey heron stood at the edge of the water, perfectly still on its long, thin legs, its neck folded into an S shape and its dagger-like beak pointed toward the surface. The bird was the color of smoke and ash, its plumage a soft blue-gray that blended so completely with the mist and the rain that it might have been a piece of dead wood or a stump of broken branch, except for the intense stillness of its posture, a stillness that spoke of concentrated patience. The Verderer made no sound and no sudden movement, and the horse, still drinking, had not noticed the bird at all. The heron stood there for a long time, the water flowing past its legs and making a small V-shaped ripple that spread downstream, and then with a slow, deliberate motion it stretched its neck upward, unfolded its great broad wings that were as wide as a man is tall, and lifted itself from the water with 2 slow flaps that sent a shower of droplets falling from its feet. It rose into the grey air and flew upstream, its wing beats slow and heavy, its long legs trailing behind, and it vanished into the mist that hung over the alders without making a single sound beyond the soft creak of its wings. The Verderer watched the heron go, and then he dismounted slowly, landing on the wet stones with a crunch that the horse ignored entirely. Its attention still on the water, he led the animal a few paces upstream to a place where the bank was less steep and the gravel formed a flat shelf that was still above the waterline, and he looped the reins around a projecting root of an alder that had been exposed by years of current washing the soil away. The horse raised its head and looked at him with one dark eye, water dripping from its muzzle, and then it lowered its head again and began to nose at the wet gravel as if searching for something to eat, though there was nothing there but stone and mud. The Verderer walked along the bank with his head down, scanning the narrow strip of silt that lay between the water and the tree roots. The margin of the brook was a place where many animals came to drink, and their tracks were preserved here in the soft mud with unusual clarity, owing to the fine texture of the silt washed down from the higher ground. He found the tracks of deer almost immediately, a confusion of overlapping prints pressed into a patch of mud where the bank sloped gently to the water. The hoof marks of several different animals coming and going, some sharp-edged and recent, others blurred and half-filled with water from a previous rise in the brook. He knelt to examine them, the wet gravel pressing into his knees through the wool of his leggings, and he sorted through the jumble of impressions with the patience of a man reading a complicated text. There were the tracks of at least 3 deer, 2 does, and a larger animal that might have been a young buck, its prints slightly broader and deeper than the others. They had come down to the water at different times, the freshest track having been made after the last rainfall when the silt was still soft, the older ones pressed into mud that had since dried slightly and then been wetted again. Alongside the deer tracks he found the wedge-shaped prints of a badger, 5 in a row where the animal had waddled down to the water's edge and then turned back, its broad hind foot leaving an impression like a miniature bear's paw, with 5 distinct toe pads and the mark of long claws at the front. The badger track was several hours old, its edges crumbling slightly, and a fallen alder leaf had drifted into one of the prints and stuck there, half submerged in the rainwater that had collected in the depression. Smaller marks were scattered everywhere across the mud, the fine 3-toed prints of birds that had come to drink or to feed on the insects that lived in the wet silt. He saw the arrowhead marks of a moorhen, the delicate scratches of a wagtail, and the parallel lines drawn by a water vole dragging its tail as it slipped from the bank into the stream. Each of these signs the verderer noted and dismissed as common, unimportant to the tally he was keeping, but he gathered them into his awareness anyway, as part of the full picture of the forest that he carried always in his mind. He stood up slowly, his knees stiff from the kneeling, and he walked a few more paces along the bank to where a small side channel had formed during the recent floods, a narrow cut in the earth that diverted a tongue of water through a stand of reeds and then back into the main brook. At the entrance to this side channel, the water had deposited a layer of fine dark silt that was as smooth as a writing surface, and here the verderer found a concentration of fresh deer tracks, all heading in the same direction. He knelt again, unclasped his pouch, and drew out the notched stick and the wax tablet. This time he measured several prints, finding them all consistent with the group of does he had been following in his mind since the morning, the sizes matching, and the stride lengths suggesting unhurried movement. He smoothed the fresh space on the wax with the flat end of the stylus, and scratched a new set of marks, a repeat of the doe sign with a tally of 3 strokes, then the location mark for the brook, then a small additional sign that he used to indicate water level, a wavy horizontal line with a dot above it, meaning the stream was running high. He closed the tablet, returned it to the pouch, and stood up again, looking out over the swollen brook, and noting that the water was still rising, small twigs and leaves racing past on the surface at a speed that suggested the rain upstream was heavier than what fell here. The rain on his hood had intensified slightly, the drops now making a steady drumming sound that was different from the pattering of earlier, lower in pitch and more insistent. He walked back to the horse, which had not moved from the alder root, and he checked the girth and the bridle with a quick touch before mounting again, the saddle leather squelching under his weight as he settled into the seat. The horse turned away from the brook without being asked, its instinct telling it that the track continued on the far side of the alder thicket, and the verderer let it pick its own route through the wet undergrowth, the branches of the alders brushing against his legs and showering him with cold drops that ran down the outside of his boots and into the tops, where they joined the general wetness already inside. As they moved away from the brook, the sound of the rushing water faded gradually, replaced again by the softer sounds of the woodland interior, the drip of leaves and the squelch of mud, and the occasional creak of a branch rubbing against another in the faint breeze that had begun to stir the higher branches. The verderer rode on with his hands resting lightly on the pommel of the saddle, his eyes still scanning the ground ahead, and the long, slow loop of his patrol continued to unroll before him like a strip of wet parchment marked with the signs of deer and water and the quiet passing of the autumn hours. The verderer rode on from the brook through a long stretch of woodland where the ground rose gradually and the trees thinned to reveal glimpses of a wide grassy opening ahead. a place he knew as Fair Mead. This clearing had been a meadow within the forest for longer than any record could tell, a natural open space where the grass grew thick and the deer came to graze in the early mornings and late evenings. Now in October, the grass was faded to a pale yellow-brown and lay flattened in sweeping drifts where the rain and wind had beaten it down. But it was still a place of importance in the Verderer's mental map of the royal forest, a fixed point around which the movements of the deer herds often turned. At the centre of Fairmead stood a single ancient oak tree of such size and age that it had a name among the foresters and verderers who had worked this wood for generations. The Fairmead tree, a pollard oak whose trunk was a massive bole of gnarled wood from which a crown of thinner branches sprouted like the strands of an unkempt head of hair. The horse walked toward the tree at the same steady pace it had kept all morning, its ears pricked forward at the sight of the open ground, and the verderer let it choose its own path through the wet grass. The rain had slackened again, to a fine drizzle that misted the air and clung to the long blades of grass, soaking the horse's lower legs as it pushed through the meadow. The sky overhead was a uniform pale grey with no variation in tone, no darker patches to suggest a break in the clouds, and the light it shed was soft and even, casting no visible shadows on the ground so that the whole clearing appeared flat and slightly unreal, like a painting on a plaster wall. The verderer's hood had slipped back slightly as he rode, and the drizzle settled on his hair and forehead, beading there without running, adding a faint chill to his scalp that he ignored as he ignored all the small discomforts of the wet. The Fairmead tree grew larger as they approached, its true size becoming apparent only when measured against the horse and rider. The trunk was a solid cylinder of ancient wood, perhaps 8 feet in diameter at its base, swelling upward into a bowl that was wider still, a great knotted mass of wood that had been cut back many times over many centuries. From the top of this bowl sprouted a thicket of thinner branches, some as straight as spears, others twisted and curved, all of them bare of leaves in this season and dark against the grey sky. The bark of the trunk was deeply furrowed into vertical ridges and plates that ran with water from the earlier rain, each crevice a dark line that traced the contours of the wood like the veins on the back of an old man's hand. Moss grew in thick cushions on the north side of the trunk, a vivid green that seemed almost luminous against the dark bark, and in the moss small ferns had rooted themselves, their fronds drooping under the weight of the collected moisture. The verderer drew the horse to a halt beneath the outer branches of the tree and dismounted, his boots sinking into the mat of old acorn shells and dead grass that cushioned the ground under the canopy. The tree's branches, though bare, still formed a loose roof overhead that had intercepted much of the rain, so the earth beneath the tree was merely damp rather than sodden, a detail the verderer noted with a small sense of bodily comfort. He led the horse to a low limb that extended horizontally from the bowl at the height of a man's shoulder, a branch thick as a man's thigh and worn smooth on its upper surface where many hands had grasped it over the years. He looped the reins loosely around this branch, giving the horse enough slack to lower its head and graze on the grass that grew right up to the tree's base, and the animal immediately began to crop the wet blades with a soft tearing sound. The verderer walked a slow circle around the Fairmead tree, his eyes travelling over the trunk and the ground and the lower branches in a careful inspection that he performed every time he visited this place. He was looking for any sign of unauthorized cutting, for the marks of an axe or a saw that would indicate someone had been taking wood without license from the royal forest. He was looking for any snare or trap that a poacher might have set among the roots, a loop of wire or cord hidden in the grass, though the foresters had been through this area recently and he expected to find nothing. He was looking for the tracks and droppings of deer that would tell him how recently the herd had used this meadow as a feeding ground. He walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, the hem of his cloak dragging through the wet grass and gathering a dark line of moisture that crept upward through the wool. The bark of the Fairmead tree was unmarked by any recent cutting, though he noted the old healed scars of past pollarding, great calluses of wood that had grown over the wounds where branches had been removed decades before. These scars were part of the tree's long history, and the verderer knew them all individually, the shape and position of each one fixed in his memory. He completed his circuit of the trunk and found nothing amiss, no fresh damage, no sign of human intrusion, and he allowed himself a small internal nod of satisfaction that was the nearest he came to an emotional response in the course of his duties. The tree was as it should be, standing in its meadow, doing the slow work of an oak in autumn, which was waiting out the winter to come. Beneath the tree, the ground was thickly covered with fallen acorns, a mast crop so heavy this year that the grass was almost hidden under the layer of nuts. Each acorn was a smooth oval of rich brown, capped at one end with a tiny cup of rougher texture that was still attached to most of them. The cup scaly and pale brown against the darker nut. The Verderer bent and picked one up, rolling it between his fingers, and he noted that it was sound and full, not hollowed out by weevils, as sometimes happened in a lean year. This was the third heavy-mast autumn in a row in this part of the forest, which explained why the king's deer were so numerous and in such good condition, a fact he had recorded on his tablet the previous week when he counted 23 fallow deer in a single herd near the eastern pale. He tossed the acorn back to the ground, where it clicked softly against its fellows and rolled to a stop against a protruding root. At the base of the trunk on the south side, where the ground was slightly raised and dry, he found a scatter of deer droppings that were no more than a few days old. The pellets were dark brown and firm, their surfaces still showing the faint sheen of moisture that indicated they had not yet dried out completely. He crouched beside them and noted that they were the droppings of a mixed group, some pellets large and blunt from a buck, others smaller and more pointed from does, all concentrated in one area where the animals had lain down to rest and chew their cud in the shelter of the great tree. The grass here was pressed flat in several oval patches that were the beds of resting deer, each one roughly 4 feet long and still showing the faint outline of a body pressed into the soft earth. The Verderer took the tablet from his pouch and added a quick note to his other marks, a simple symbol that meant good grazing, plentiful mast, deer in residence. He straightened and walked to the edge of the canopy, where the grass grew longer and the acorn layer thinned out into the open meadow. From here he could see across the whole of Fairmead, the pale grass stretching away to a line of dark trees on the far side perhaps 200 paces distant. The rain had not stopped, but it had become so fine that it was more a presence in the air than a falling thing, a grey veil that softened every edge and blurred the far tree line into a gentle wash of brown and charcoal. Nothing moved in the meadow except the slow drift of a single magpie that flew across the open space and disappeared into a holly bush with a flash of its white wing patches. The Verderer stood still and let his gaze travel slowly around the perimeter, checking for any anomaly, any movement that should not be there, any sign of a trespasser or a wounded animal. But the meadow was empty of everything except the grass and the rain and the quiet. The quiet here was different from the quiet of the deep wood. In the forest, the silence was layered with small sounds, the drip of water from leaves, the scurry of beetles in the leaf litter, the distant calls of hidden birds. Here in the open meadow, the quiet was more complete, a deeper stillness that seemed to absorb even the sound of the rain, which fell without noise into the long grass. The Verderer stood within that quiet and let it settle around him, not demanding anything of it, simply sharing the space with the Fairmead tree and the grey sky and the patient horse that cropped the grass behind him with a steady, rhythmic sound. He had been riding since before dawn and had not eaten since his bowl of porridge at the lodge, and the feeling of hunger began to make itself known as a small hollow sensation that was not yet urgent but would become so before the afternoon was over. He returned to the tree and sat down on one of the great roots that rose from the earth like a curved bench. A root, perhaps 2 feet wide and covered with the same deep furrowed bark as the trunk, its surface worn smooth on top where generations of foresters and verderers had sat before him. He reached inside his cloak and drew out the small cloth bundle he had packed that morning, unwrapping it on his knee to reveal a piece of hard cheese the size of his fist, a strip of dried venison as long as his hand and dark as old leather, and a heel of dark rye bread wrapped separately in a scrap of linen. The cheese was pale yellow and slightly crumbly at the edges, made from ewe's milk in the village and aged in the dairy until it had a sharp, clean taste that cut through the blandness of the bread. The venison was tough and salty, requiring him to tear off small pieces with his teeth and chew them slowly, the flavour of the meat filling his mouth with a rich smokiness that came from the drying racks in the forester's hut. He ate without hurry, sitting on the root with his back against the rough bark of the trunk, his gaze moving idly across the meadow while his jaw worked steadily through the hard food. The horse, hearing him eat, lifted its head from the grass and looked at him with one dark eye, and the verderer broke off a corner of the bread and held it out on his flat palm. The horse took it gently with its soft lips, the whiskers brushing his hand, and then returned to its grazing. The verderer finished his meal and carefully folded the cloths back around the remaining food, tucking them away inside his cloak. He sat for a while longer on the root, not resting exactly, but simply pausing, allowing the horse to graze and his own body to recover from the hours in the saddle. The rain had stopped altogether now, or at least had paused, and the silence of the meadow grew even deeper without the soft hiss of its falling. From somewhere in the wood beyond the meadow, a great spotted woodpecker began to tap, a quick series of strikes against dead wood that echoed through the trees and then stopped, then began again a moment later from slightly farther away. The verderer listened to the woodpecker and watched a pair of wrens flitting in and out of a tangle of bramble at the edge of the grass, and the minutes passed without any marker except the gradual brightening of the grey sky as the sun climbed unseen toward its noon position. At last he stood up, brushing a few fragments of bark from his cloak, and he walked to the horse to check the girth and the bridle one more time. The horse had grazed a wide circle around the tree, the grass cropped short where it had been able to reach, and it looked up at the verderer with a placid expression that suggested it was ready to continue whenever asked. The man untied the reins from the low branch and took a final look at the Fairmead tree, completing his mental notes on the condition of the mast, the health of the deer sign, the state of the bark and the branches. Then he returned to the saddle with one smooth upward motion, the leather and wool of his clothing all creaking softly together, and he turned the horse's head toward the far side of the meadow where the track entered the hornbeam coppice. The next stage of his long, slow circuit already mapped in his mind. The tablet in its pouch, marked with the record of the great oak and its heavy crop of acorns that would feed the king's deer through the lean months to come. The verderer left the open meadow of Fairmead behind him, and guided the horse into the dense stand of hornbeam and hazel that grew on the eastern side of the clearing, a section of the royal forest that had been managed as coppice for as long as the court rolls could remember. The transition from open grass to enclosed woodland was immediate and complete, the grey sky vanishing overhead as the branches closed above the track like the roof beams of a great hall, leaving the verderer in a dim greenish light that was filtered through a lattice of bare twigs and the few remaining leaves that still clung to the lower branches. The track here was narrower than it had been in the outer wood, a sunken way that had been worn down over centuries by the passage of carts and horses and the feet of men carrying bundles of cut poles, and its sides rose up on either hand in low banks covered with moss and the roots of trees that gripped the earth like dark fingers. The rain which had paused at Fairmead now began again, a steady fall that made a soft hissing sound as it passed through the thousand twigs of the coppice, and the verderer pulled his hood forward once more, the wool settling around his face with the comfort of long habit. The coppice was divided into sections called cantons, each one cut on a different rotation, so that every year some part of it produced a crop of straight poles, while other parts rested and regrew. The verderer knew the boundary of each canton by the marker stones set at the corners, small squared blocks of granite with numbers chiseled into their upper faces, though the numbers were now so worn by weather that they could only be read by a man who already knew what they said. He passed the first of these stones as he rode deeper into the coppice, glancing down at it to confirm its position, and he noted that the stone was still upright and the ground around it undisturbed, no sign of anyone having tried to move or alter the boundary. The stone was dark with wet, and a small yellow snail was making its way slowly across the chiseled surface, its shell a perfect spiral of pale brown that glistened in the rain. The growth on either side of the track changed as he moved from one canton to the next. On his left was a section that had been cut 3 winters before, the stool sending up a dense growth of straight rods as thick as a man's thumb, and already 8 feet tall, their bark a smooth grey-green that shone with the wet. The rods grew so close together that they formed a solid wall of wood on either side of the track, a palisade of living stems that swayed gently in the breeze that now moved through the upper canopy, and the verderer could see how the topmost twigs had already begun to branch and spread, competing for the light that would come in the spring. On his right was an older section that had not been cut for 7 years, the stools here producing poles as thick as a man's wrist and 20 feet tall, their lower trunks bare of leaves and their upper branches beginning to look like proper trees rather than mere rods. In another 3 years, this section would be ready for cutting again, the wood used for fencing and wattle and the 100 other purposes that the forest supplied to the villages and manors round about. The verderer rode slowly, his eyes moving from one side of the track to the other, checking the condition of the stools and the straightness of the poles, looking for any sign of disease or damage or unauthorized cutting. The stool of a hornbeam coppice was a remarkable thing, an old root mass that had been cut back so many times over so many decades that it had swollen into a knobby platform of wood from which the new shoots sprang in a ring around the edge. The center sometimes hollowed out and filled with rainwater that reflected the sky in small dark circles. Each stool was a separate living thing with its own shape and character, and the verderer knew many of them individually, the ones that produced the straightest poles and the ones that were beginning to weaken and would need to be replaced with new layering in the coming years. He noted a stool on the left side that had been damaged by a falling branch from an overhanging oak, 2 of its rods snapped off halfway up and hanging by strips of bark, the wound already beginning to rot in the wet. He stopped the horse and dismounted to examine the damage more closely, pulling the broken rods free with a firm tug and laying them to the side of the track where they would not block the passage. He would mark this on the tablet, he decided, so that the forester responsible for this quarter could come and trim the wound properly before the rot spread into the stool itself. The rain fell harder as he remounted, the sound of it increasing from a soft hiss to a steady drumming on the hood of his cloak and on the broad leaves of the few hazel bushes that still held their foliage, their leaves now turning a pale, sickly yellow that seemed almost bright in the dimness of the coppice. Water ran in rivulets down the horse's flanks, tracing the contours of the muscles beneath the wet coat, and the animal shook its head from time to time, the bridle rings chiming with a dull musical note that was the only sound besides the rain and the squelch of the hooves in the mud. The track descended into a shallow dip where the water had pooled across the entire width of the way, and the horse splashed through it with a sucking noise that told of deep mud beneath the puddle, its legs sinking to the fetlocks and then pulling free with an effort that the verderer felt through the saddle as a slight hesitation in the horse's forward motion. On the far side of the dip, the coppice changed character again, the hornbeam giving way to a stand of hazel that had been planted or had self-seeded here many years before. The hazel stools were smaller and more numerous than the hornbeam, each one sending up a dozen or more thin rods that arched outward in a fountain shape before straightening toward the light. The rods were bare of leaves, but many of them carried the small dangling catkins that would open in the spring, pale yellow-green and heavy with water, each one a tiny bell that swayed as the verderer passed and shed its drops onto his legs. The hazel rods were the most valuable product of the coppice, used for making hurdles and baskets and the wattle framework of house walls, and the verderer noted with satisfaction that this year's growth had been strong and straight, the rods free of the canker that sometimes afflicted hazel in wet years. He stopped the horse again at a place where the track divided, one branch leading deeper into the coppice and the other turning back toward the main ride that ran through the center of the forest. At the fork stood another marker, this one a post of oak driven into the ground with a carved letter on its top that indicated the quarter and the canton number. The verderer dismounted to inspect the post, which was leaning slightly to one side where the ground had softened in the rain, and he pushed it back to upright with his shoulder, stamping the earth down around its base with the heel of his boot. The earth was so saturated that water welled up around the post as he stamped, filling the hole he had made with a brown soup of clay and leaf mould, and he knew that the post would need to be reset more firmly when the ground dried in the spring, if it ever did. He marked this also on the tablet, scratching a simple symbol that meant boundary marker needs repair, and then he remounted and turned the horse onto the branch of the track that led deeper into the coppice. Here the woodland was darker and the track less well-defined, a mere footpath that wound between the close-packed stools where the canopy of rods met overhead and blocked out much of the sky. The rain reached the ground here not as distinct drops, but as a fine spray that had been broken up by the network of twigs above, and the air was full of the smell of wet hazel bark, a clean, sharp scent like the smell of fresh-cut wood, but softer, greener. The verderer ducked his head under a low arch formed by 2 hazel rods that had grown together and fused at the tips, and he noted that someone had been this way before him, a few of the rods at the side of the path showing fresh cuts where they had been trimmed back to clear the way. The cuts were clean and made with a sharp billhook, the work of one of the foresters maintaining the access path, and the verderer noted this as legitimate work, requiring no further record. Deep in the heart of the coppice, the verderer came to a small open area, where an old hornbeam stool had died and was now a stump of grey wood, soft with rot, its surface covered with a thick growth of bracket fungi that jutted out like shells, each one banded in shades of brown and cream and holding a tiny pool of water on its upper surface. The ground around the dead stool had been colonized by bramble and bracken, the brambles still holding a few withered blackberries that had not been found by the birds, the bracken fronds collapsed and brown and lying in a tangle that the horse stepped through with a crackling of dry stems. The verderer looked down at the dead stool and made a mental note that the space it had left would need to be filled with a new layered stool to maintain the density of the coppice. But this was a task for the spring and not for a wet October day when the ground was too soft for planting anything. He rode on through the coppice, his progress slow and methodical, the horse's hooves making a soft squelching sound in the deep leaf mould that had accumulated under the stools. The rain continued without any lessening, a steady downpour that filled the air with a constant rushing noise like the sound of a distant waterfall, and the verderer felt the water beginning to work its way through the seams of his cloak. A slow cold creep that started at his shoulders and moved downward across his back. He did not hurry. He had been wet before, would be wet again, and the cold was merely a fact of the day, like the grey light in the bare branches and the endless dripping of the coppice. He checked the condition of the stools on both sides as he passed, noting the ones that were ready for cutting and the ones that needed another year, noting the straightness of the poles and the health of the regrowth, and he recalled a few brief marks on the tablet, holding the reins on his knee while he scratched the symbols into the dark wax with the practiced motion of his right hand. At the far edge of the coppice, the trees began to thin again, and the track rose slightly, climbing out of the sunken way onto a low ridge where the soil was sandier and the drainage better. The verderer could hear the sound of another stream somewhere ahead, a smaller tributary of Hart's Brook that ran through a narrow valley just beyond the coppice boundary, and he knew that he would need to check the stream crossing before he continued his circuit toward the eastern pale. The horse lifted its head as they left the enclosure of the coppice and seemed to move with a slightly freer stride, now that it was no longer brushing against the close walls of hazel rods, and the verderer patted its neck once with a wet glove, the gesture so small and habitual that neither man nor horse gave it any particular notice. The coppice fell away behind them, its thousands of straight grey stems fading into the rain and mist until they were nothing more than a soft blur of vertical lines, and the verderer turned his attention to the sound of the stream ahead and the next stage of his slow wet patrol. The verderer guided the horse along a narrow ride that ran between two sections of the hornbeam coppice, a grassy way that was little more than a wide path but served as one of the main routes through this quarter of the royal forest. The rain had lessened somewhat as the morning wore on toward noon, though it had not stopped, and the sky remained a uniform pale grey that gave no indication of the sun's position behind the clouds. The ride was bordered on both sides by dense walls of hazel and hornbeam that rose 15 feet high, their bare stems dripping with a steady percussion of water drops that fell from twig to twig before reaching the ground, and the grass of the ride itself was long and flattened, criss-crossed with the tracks of deer that used this route as regularly as the verderer himself. The horse walked with its head low, picking its way around the deeper puddles that had formed in the wheel ruts of a cart that had passed this way in drier weather, and the verderer sat relaxed in the saddle, his eyes moving slowly over the ground and the undergrowth on either side, reading the signs of the morning's passage of animals. At a bend in the ride where an old holly bush had grown out into the path, its prickly leaves still a deep glossy green against the grey of the bare branches around it, the verderer felt the horse's stride alter slightly. The animal's ears, which had been slouched forward in a lazy posture, suddenly pricked up and swiveled toward the right, toward a dense thicket of blackthorn and elder that grew beyond the holly. The horse did not stop or shy, but its neck arched slightly and its nostrils widened, sampling the air with a long, slow breath. The verderer, who had been watching the horse's ears since he mounted that morning, noted the change and followed the direction of its gaze with his own eyes, peering into the thicket. He saw nothing at first, only the tangle of bare dark branches and the grey mist beyond. But he trusted the horse's senses and drew the animal to a halt with a gentle pressure on the reins. He sat motionless in the saddle, his hands still on the reins, his body balanced and quiet, and he waited. The rain dripped from the edge of his hood with a soft, regular sound, and the horse's breath steamed from its nostrils in slow clouds that hung for a moment in the damp air before dissolving. For a long minute, nothing happened, and the verderer did not move, did not shift his weight or adjust his cloak, or do any of the small things that a restless man might do. He had learned patience long ago, the patience of a man who spent his days watching and waiting and recording, and he knew that the forest revealed itself only to those who did not demand revelation. So he sat, and he waited, and the horse waited with him, its ears still fixed on the thicket. Then he saw them. Through the lattice of blackthorn branches, perhaps half a furlong distant across a small clearing that was hidden from the ride by the thicket, a herd of fallow deer was moving slowly through the trees. The verderer saw the pale brown shapes first as patches of colour that shifted and moved among the grey trunks, and then as individual animals that resolved out of the mist like figures emerging from a tapestry. He did not move, did not reach for his tablet, did not even turn his head more than a fraction. He simply watched, his eyes taking in the details of the herd with the quick and thorough attention of long practice. There were 14 animals in total, a number he arrived at by counting not the bodies but the legs, a trick he had learned from the old verderer who had trained him. He counted 11 does, and young animals, the does smaller and more lightly built, their coats a warm fawn colour spotted with the fading white dots of summer that would disappear entirely when their thicker winter coats came in. Among them were 3 bucks, larger and darker, their coats shading to a greyish brown along their flanks, and each buck carried a fine set of palmate antlers that spread wide from their heads like 2 flattened hands with fingers extended. The antlers were dark with the wet, and the verderer could see that the velvet had been completely rubbed off, leaving the bone bare and polished to a dull gleam, a sign that the rut was approaching but had not yet begun in earnest. One of the bucks was older, its antlers heavier and more branched, and it walked with a slow, deliberate gait at the rear of the herd, pausing often to lift its head and test the air. The herd was grazing as it moved, the deer lowering their heads to crop at the wet grass that grew in the clearing and then lifting them again to chew, their jaws moving in a slow, sideways motion that was visible even at this distance. They were heading generally eastward, toward the thicker woodland beyond the clearing, and they moved without any sign of alarm, their steps unhurried, and their postures relaxed. The verderer noted that one of the does was heavy with the roundness of good autumn feeding, her belly full and her coat glossy, a sign that this year's mast was doing its work in preparing the herd for the lean months of winter. Another doe had a slight limp, favouring her left foreleg, though she kept up with the herd without difficulty and seemed otherwise in good condition. The verderer filed these observations away in his memory, details that would go into his report to the chief forester when the season's counts were gathered. The horse stood as still as the verderer, its head now turned slightly toward the herd, its ears still pricked, but its body relaxed, as if it had identified the scent and knew there was no danger. The rain continued to fall, a soft, steady veil that blurred the outlines of the deer and made them seem to move through water rather than air, and the verderer remained in his saddle, like a carved figure on a tomb, his cloak dark with moisture, and his face shadowed by the hood. He knew that if he made any sudden movement or sound, the herd would startle and flee, their white rump patches flashing as they bounded away into the deeper wood. And while he did not need to approach them or capture them, he preferred to observe them undisturbed for as long as possible. The deer were the reason for his being here, the living wealth of the royal forest, and every detail of their numbers and condition was a piece of knowledge that mattered to the verderer's office. One of the does, a younger animal that was perhaps 2 years old and still carried a faint line of spots along her flank, raised her head from the grass and looked directly toward the thicket where the verderer sat hidden. She stood frozen for a moment, her large dark ears swivelling forward, her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. The verderer held his breath, though he knew the horse's scent would have reached her already, and his own scent was masked by the rain and the wet wool of his cloak. The doe stared at the thicket for a long count of perhaps 20 heartbeats, and the verderer saw her flanks move with the rhythm of her breathing, saw the way the rain beaded on her eyelashes and ran down the bridge of her narrow face. Then she lowered her head again and resumed grazing, and the rest of the herd, which had paused to watch her, did the same. The moment of tension passed without event, and the deer continued their slow progress across the clearing. The verderer watched the herd for a long time, committing their numbers to memory with the silent repetition that ensured he would not forget. He counted them again to be certain, moving his eyes from one animal to the next and touching each one with his gaze like a man telling beads on a rosary. 14 animals, 3 bucks, and 11 does, all in good condition except for the one limping doe, the herd moving east at a slow walk, grazing on the autumn grass. He noted the time of day by the quality of the light, which was still that pale, even grey that marked the approach of noon. And he noted the location by the landmarks he could see from his position, the bent holly bush and the distant spire of a dead oak that rose above the thicket like a grey finger pointing at the sky. Only when the last of the deer had moved out of sight into the trees on the far side of the clearing, their pale shapes fading one by one into the mist and the shadow, did the verderer reach slowly for the pouch at his belt. He drew out the wax tablet and the stylus with careful, deliberate movements, making no more sound than the soft creak of leather and the faint click of the wooden boards as he opened them. The horse shifted its weight slightly, one hind hoof cocked in relaxation, and the verderer smoothed a fresh patch of wax with the flat end of the stylus before he began to write. He scratched the symbol for fallow deer, then a numeral for 14, then the separate marks for buck and doe and young, then the sign that indicated the animals were in good health, and finally the location mark for the clearing beyond the blackthorn thicket. He added a small notation that meant one doe with a limp, a mark that would remind him to mention it to the forester, so that the animal could be watched in case the injury worsened. The wax took the marks cleanly, and the verderer closed the tablet with a soft click, returning it to the pouch and securing the toggle. The horse, released from its stillness by the completion of the task, lowered its head and snorted softly, a single puff of breath that stirred the wet grass at its feet. The verderer gathered up the reins and touched his heels lightly to the horse's flanks, and the animal moved forward again along the ride, its hooves squelching in the mud with a sound that seemed loud after the silence of the long watch. The verderer looked back once over his shoulder at the clearing where the deer had been, but it was empty now, only the rain falling on the wet grass and the distant line of trees fading into the mist. He turned forward again and let the horse walk on, and the ride curved away from the thicket and led them deeper into the forest, toward the forester's hut that stood at the heart of the thorn grove, the next point on his slow circuit of the royal wood. The verderer rode on from the clearing where the herd had been counted and guided the horse into a part of the royal forest that few people ever entered. A dense thicket of holly and blackthorn and old gnarled hawthorn trees that grew so closely together that their branches interlocked overhead to form a living roof of thorn and glossy leaf. The track here was barely visible, a narrow winding way that ducked under low branches and skirted around the massive trunks of ancient thorns, whose bark was so dark and rough that it seemed to absorb the grey light without reflecting any of it back. The rain had lightened to a fine, persistent drizzle that hung in the air like cold steam, and the thicket held the moisture close, the leaves of the holly bushes glistening with a waxy sheen, and the blackthorn twigs beaded with strings of droplets that trembled but did not fall. The horse moved through this dense growth with care, its ears flicking forward and back as it navigated the narrow passage, its flanks brushing against the wet leaves on either side and leaving dark streaks on its coat. The verderer knew this place as well as he knew any part of the forest, though he visited it less often than the open rides and the meadow edges. At the very heart of the thicket, hidden from every approach by a screen of holly that grew taller than a man on horseback, stood the forester's hut, a small timber-framed shelter that served as a way station for the men who worked this quarter of the royal wood. The hut was not visible from the track, and a stranger passing by would never have known it was there, but the verderer turned the horse at a particular holly bush that had a broken branch on its lower left side and ducked under an arch formed by 2 hawthorns that had grown together overhead, and there it was, a low, dark building tucked into a small natural clearing that the thicket had not quite claimed. The hut was built of timber and wattle and daub, Its walls a framework of split oak beams filled in with woven hazel rods plastered over with a mixture of clay and straw and lime wash that had long since faded to a mottled grey. The roof was thatched with reed and sedge, now heavy with moss that grew in thick pads of bright green and deeper olive, and the whole structure seemed to have sunk slightly into the earth over the years, as if the forest were slowly absorbing it back into itself. A single low door faced the clearing, made of rough planks of oak that had warped slightly in the damp and were held together by 3 horizontal battens fixed with iron nails that had stained the wood around them with dark streaks of rust. There were no windows, only a small opening under the gable at one end that let out the smoke of a fire, and this opening was covered by a wooden shutter that now hung slightly askew on its leather hinges. The Verderer dismounted slowly, his boots pressing into the wet leaf litter that covered the floor of the clearing, and he looped the reins around the projecting stub of a branch that had been left on a nearby holly for exactly this purpose. The horse lowered its head at once and began to nose at the sparse grass that grew in the small patch of open ground, though there was little to eat here, and the animal would have to wait until they returned to the lodge for its proper feed. The Verderer walked toward the hut, his cloak brushing against the wet fronds of a holly that grew right up to the door, and he placed his hand on the door's latch, a simple bar of wood that lifted with a dull scrape against its socket. The door swung inward with a long creak that was the voice of old wood moving against old iron, and the Verderer stepped inside the hut. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the open door behind him and the small smoke hole under the gable, which let in a faint grey glow that barely reached the corners of the single room. He stood just inside the threshold and let his eyes adjust to the darkness, breathing in the smell of the place. The hut smelled of old wood smoke, a dry, acrid scent that clung to the walls and the thatch and never quite went away, no matter how long the fire had been out. Under the smoke was the smell of damp earth, the clay of the floor giving off a cool mineral odor that was like the smell of a cave. And under that again was a faint trace of something else, the musty scent of old straw from a mattress that had long since been taken away, and the sharper smell of the herbs that someone had once hung from the rafters to keep away moths, their dried leaves now reduced to dust that sifted down whenever the wind shook the building. The hut was empty. This was the first thing the Verderer checked, not because he expected to find anyone there, but because it was his duty to know. The single room was perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a beaten earth floor that had been worn smooth by the passage of many feet and was now slightly damp to the touch, the clay showing a darker color near the door where the rain had blown in over the threshold. Against one wall stood a low wooden bed frame with no mattress, only the slats of split ash that would have supported a straw pallet now long since removed. Against the opposite wall was a simple shelf made of a single plank of oak, resting on 2 pegs driven into the wall, and on the shelf sat a clay lamp that still held a residue of old tallow in its bowl, the fat now grey and cracked with age. A small hearth of river stones was set into the centre of the floor, its stones blackened with soot, and a rusted iron trivet still stood over the ashes of the last fire that had been lit here, though the Verderer could not remember when that had been, perhaps the previous winter, when a forester had been caught by snow and had sheltered here overnight. The Verderer moved slowly around the interior, his boots making soft scuffing sounds on the clay floor, and he conducted his inspection with the same methodical care that he applied to every part of his duties. He checked the walls first, running his gloved hand over the wattle and door panels between the timber studs, feeling for any softness or cracking that would let in the rain. The daub was damp to the touch, as everything was damp in this season, but it was sound, the lime wash still holding in most places, though it had flaked away in patches near the floor. He found a place near the north corner where a small crack had opened between 2 of the hazel withies, no wider than his finger, but enough to let a draught through, and he made a mental note of it for repair before the winter set in. He tilted his head back and looked up at the underside of the thatch, scanning the rafters and the reed with a slow, careful gaze. The thatch was old and had settled over the years into a dense mat that was dark with smoke and age, but it was still holding, still shedding the rain that fell on it outside. Near the north corner, directly above the crack in the wall, he saw a small dark patch where water had been seeping through, the reed stained a deeper brown, and the binding twine that held the thatch in place beginning to rot. A single drop of water was forming on the underside of the thatch even as he watched, swelling slowly until it was as large as a pea, and then it fell with a soft sound onto the clay floor below, landing in a small depression that had been worn into the earth by many such drops over many weeks. The verderer watched the drop fall and then another begin to form, and he marked this on his mental list as well, a task for the thatcher when the weather allowed. He checked the hearth next, kneeling to push a finger into the cold ashes that filled the stone circle. The ashes were dry and loose, no sign of any recent fire, and he saw no fresh charcoal, no fragments of bone or food that would indicate someone had been using the hut without leave. The trivet was in place and the stones of the hearth were all sound, none of them cracked by heat or shifted by frost. The verderer stood up and brushed the ash from his glove, the fine grey powder leaving a faint smear on the dark, wet leather. He walked to the shelf and examined the clay lamp, tilting it to see inside, but there was nothing there except the old tallow and the wick that had burned down to a stub of charred flax. He set it back in its place and ran his eyes over the bed frame, which was empty and dusty but otherwise whole, the joints still tight and the wood free of rot. At the back of the hut, tucked into the corner between the bed frame and the wall, he found a small pile of firewood that someone had left, a few split logs of hornbeam, and a bundle of dry kindling tied with a withe of hazel. The wood was dry and sound, and the verderer added a stick of kindling to the small bundle he carried in his mind of things to be grateful for, knowing that the next man to use this hut might arrive cold and wet and in need of a fire. He left the wood where it was and completed his circuit of the room, finding nothing else that required his attention, no signs of disturbance or damage beyond the crack in the wall and the drip in the thatch. He stepped back to the door and stood in the opening for a moment, looking out at the small clearing and the horse waiting in the rain. The thicket all around was utterly still, the holly leaves gleaming and the blackthorn branches hanging heavy with water, and the only sound was the steady drip of rain from leaf to leaf and the soft sigh of the horse's breathing. The verderer closed the door of the hut carefully behind him, making sure the latch caught and held, and then he walked back to the horse, his boots squelching in the wet leaf mould. He drew out the wax tablet and the stylus, balanced the tablet on the saddle while the horse stood patiently, and he scratched a few brief marks into the wax, a note that the hut had been inspected and was sound, except for the crack and the drip, which he indicated with a simple symbol that meant repair needed. He closed the tablet and tucked it away, untied the reins from the holly branch, and swung himself back into the saddle with a creak of wet leather and a soft grunt of effort. The horse turned without being asked and began to pick its way back through the narrow track into the thicket, its hooves silent on the deep carpet of fallen leaves, and the verderer rode on, leaving the little hut to its quiet vigil in the heart of the thorn grove. The verderer guided the horse away from the hidden hut and the dense enclosure of the thorn thicket, turning now toward the long earthwork known as the inner pale that ran through this quarter of the royal forest like a seam stitched across a piece of green cloth. The track that led to the pale was a narrow ride that had not been cleared recently, its surface overgrown with wet bracken and the trailing stems of bramble that caught at the horse's legs as it pushed through, but the animal knew the way and did not falter. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, no longer the heavy downpour of the mid-morning, but a patient, persistent fall that seemed as though it would continue without pause for the rest of the day and into the night beyond. And the verderer accepted it as he accepted all the other conditions of his office, without complaint and without particular notice. The pale emerged from the trees ahead as a long dark line that cut across the woodland, a ditch and bank that had been dug centuries before by men whose names were now forgotten even by the oldest records in the manor rolls. It was not a fortification in any military sense, but a legal boundary, a physical mark upon the earth that separated the inner royal demesne from the outer woodlands where certain commoners held rights of estover and pannage and turbary. The ditch was on the inner side, a deep V-shaped trench that was now half filled with fallen leaves and standing water, and the bank rose on the outer side, a steep earthwork planted with a line of old coppice trees whose roots gripped the soil and held the bank in place. The whole structure ran for miles through the forest, curving around the contours of the land and crossing streams and boggy ground on causeways of packed gravel and timber, and it was one of the verderer's duties to ride its length at regular intervals and check that it remained intact, that no gaps had been made, that no unauthorized persons had crossed or broken the boundary. He turned the horse onto the narrow path that ran along the top of the bank, a grassy ride just wide enough for a single horse that commanded a view of the ditch on one side and the outer woodland on the other. The horse walked carefully here, placing its hooves with deliberate precision on the uneven ground, and the verderer let it pick its own pace while he turned his attention to the ditch below. The water in the bottom of the ditch was brown and still, reflecting the grey sky and the dark shapes of the trees that leaned over it from the inner side. Fallen leaves had gathered on its surface in a thick mat that was slowly sinking, each leaf waterlogged and dark, and the smell that rose from the ditch was the rich, earthy smell of rotting vegetation and wet clay. A moorhen picked its way along a half-submerged branch that had fallen into the ditch at some point in the past year, its head bobbing with each step, its red beak bright against the muted browns and greys of the water and the leaves. The verderer rode slowly along the top of the bank, his eyes moving in a steady pattern from the ditch below, to the bank ahead, to the outer woodland beyond. He was looking for several things at once, each one a potential violation of the forest law that it was his duty to note and report. He looked for any place where the bank had been worn down or broken by the passage of animals or the deliberate action of men seeking a shorter route through the forest. He looked for any fallen tree that had toppled across the pale and created a natural bridge that a deer or a poacher could cross. He looked for any sign of digging or cutting on the bank itself, any fresh earth or chopped root that would indicate someone had been trying to create a gap. And he looked for tracks in the soft ground at the base of the bank that would tell him whether anyone or anything had been moving along the pale since the last rain. For a long stretch the pale was in good order, the bank firm and unbroken, the ditch deep and holding water, the line of trees on the bank standing straight and healthy. The trees here were mostly hornbeam and field maple, their trunks coppiced at knee-height to produce multiple stems that grew upward in a dense screen, and the verderer noted that the most recent cutting had been done properly, the stills clean and the regrowth vigorous. He passed a boundary stone set into the top of the bank, a squat pillar of granite with a cross carved into its upper face, and a number chiselled below, and he saw that it was still upright and the carving still legible under its coating of dark moss. He nodded once, a small motion that no one saw, and rode on. The pale curved to the left around a slight rise in the ground, and here the ditch became deeper and wider, as it crossed a natural hollow where water collected from the higher land on either side. The verderer could see that the water level in the ditch was higher in this section, lapping at the very edge of the bank and beginning to undercut the roots of an old alder that grew at the corner. Some of the alder's roots were exposed now, pale and twisted against the dark earth, and the tree itself was leaning slightly toward the ditch, as if it was slowly bowing to the water. The verderer stopped the horse and studied the tree for a long moment, noting the angle of its lean and the extent of the root exposure, and he decided that the tree was still sound enough to stand through the winter, but would need to be watched. He made a mark on the wax tablet, a simple line with a cross through it that signified a tree at risk of falling, and he rode on. At a straight section of the pale where the bank ran for perhaps 300 paces without a curve, the verderer came upon the thing he had been watching for. A dead alder had toppled across the ditch, its trunk perhaps a foot in diameter, and its branches still tangled with the brown remnants of last year's leaves. The tree had fallen from the inner side, its roots pulling up a great plate of earth and clay that now stood on end like a crumbling wall, water streaming from its crevices and carrying small streams of silt down into the ditch below. The trunk lay directly across the pale, its top caught in the branches of a hornbeam on the bank, and it formed a solid bridge from one side to the other. The verderer saw at once that this was a problem, not a disaster, but an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with before it became a way for deer to cross out of the Royal de Mesnay or for poachers to cross in. He dismounted and tied the horse to a branch of the hornbeam that had caught the fallen tree, the animal standing with the patience it had shown all day while the verderer walked to the edge of the ditch and examined the fall. The trunk was wet and slippery, its bark already loosening in patches where the wood beneath had begun to rot, and the branches were a tangle of brittle twigs that snapped under the lightest pressure. The root plate on the far side was large and heavy, a solid wall of earth that would need to be broken apart or dug out if the tree was to be properly cleared. But that was work for a team of men with axes and mattocks, not for a single verderer on a wet October afternoon. What the verderer could do now was to break away enough of the branches and the thinner upper portion of the trunk to make the bridge impassable, at least for large animals, until the foresters could come with their tools and finish the job. He walked back to the horse and removed a small hand axe that hung in a leather sheath from the saddle, its blade dark with age and kept sharp by regular honing on a whetstone. He returned to the fallen tree and set to work, not hurrying, but not pausing either, his movements steady and deliberate. He cut away the smaller branches first, the axe biting into the wet wood with a soft thunk that was the only sound beyond the rain, each cut sending a spray of water and small chips of bark flying into the ditch below. The branches fell away one by one and he dragged them to the side, piling them on the bank where they would not obstruct the path. The wood was soft with rot and easy to cut, though the wet made the axe handle slippery in his gloved hands, and he had to pause from time to time to adjust his grip. When the branches were cleared, he turned his attention to the trunk itself, not attempting to cut through it entirely, but severing it at a point just beyond the edge of the bank, where the wood was thinner and beginning to taper toward the top. The axe bit deeper here, each stroke cutting a wedge-shaped notch that slowly widened as he worked from one side and then the other. The work was simple and repetitive. The lift and swing of the axe, the thunk of the blade into the wood, the slight jar that travelled up his arm with each impact, and the verderer fell into the rhythm of it, as he fell into all the rhythms of his day, without thought, without hurry. After a time the trunk began to creak and sag, the fibres of the remaining wood straining under the weight, and with a final stroke it cracked through and the severed upper portion fell into the ditch with a splash that sent brown water washing up the sides of the bank. The verderer straightened and wiped the rain from his face with the back of his glove, then walked along the bank to where the root plate stood exposed on the far side. The earth was still crumbling in small wet clods that pattered into the ditch, and he could see that the roots had pulled up a section of the bank itself, leaving a shallow depression that would need to be filled and tamped down. He noted this too on the wax tablet, adding a mark that meant bank repair needed at location of the fallen alder, and he made a mental note to send word to the chief forester so that a work party could be organized before the winter frosts made the ground too hard to dig. He returned to the horse and replaced the axe in its sheath, then stood for a moment looking at his work. The fallen tree now ended in a jagged stump a few feet out from the bank, its severed end pale and raw against the dark water below, and the bridge it had formed was gone. No deer would cross here now, and no man would attempt to walk out along the wet, slippery trunk without risking a fall into the ditch. It was not a permanent solution, but it was sufficient for the moment, and the verderer was satisfied. He untied the horse and led it carefully past the place where the root plate had torn the bank, the animal stepping delicately over the disturbed ground, and then he remounted and continued his slow progress along the top of the pale. The rain slackened as he rode, the steady fall thinning to a fine drizzle that drifted in the air and settled on his cloak without sound. The grey sky began to darken almost imperceptibly, the light shifting from pale silver to a deeper tone that hinted at the approach of evening, though the sun was still hidden and would remain so. The verderer rode on, his eyes still moving over the ditch and the bank and the trees, but the rest of the pale was in good order, and he found nothing more that required his attention. The next boundary stone was in place, the next stretch of ditch was clear, and the line of coppice trees stood straight and unbroken against the darkening sky. He completed his inspection of this section of the pale, and turned the horse at the marker that signified the end of his quarter, a tall post carved with the symbol of the royal forest, and he began the long ride back toward the lodge. The day's work nearly done, and the tablet in his pouch filled with the small, neat marks that recorded the condition of the king's dander. The verderer turned the horse away from the boundary marker that stood at the end of his section of the pale, and began the long, slow ride back toward the lodge at Chingford, retracing in reverse the great loop he had made through the royal forest since the early morning. The grey light of the October afternoon had begun its gradual fade toward evening, though the change was so subtle that it could only be measured by the deepening of the shadows under the trees and the way the mist that had hung in the air all day now began to thicken and gather in the hollows, rising from the wet bracken like the slow exhalation of the earth itself. The rain had softened to a fine persistent mizzle that seemed to hang suspended in the air rather than fall through it, a grey veil that blurred the outlines of the trees, and made the forest seem larger and quieter than it was. The Verderer sat deep in the saddle, his body tired in a way that was not unpleasant, the tiredness of a day spent in steady motion and steady attention, and he let the horse choose its own pace along the familiar tracks that led homeward. The horse walked with its head low now, its earlier briskness replaced by the steady plod of an animal that had been moving since dawn and knew that the day's work was nearly done. Its bay coat was dark, with the wet and streaked with mud thrown up by its own hooves, and its mane lay plastered against its neck in a single damp rope that dripped water onto the Verderer's gloves whenever the animal shook its head. The sound of its hooves on the wet track was a soft, regular squelching that had been the constant accompaniment to the Verderer's thoughts all day, a rhythm so familiar that he no longer heard it except as a background presence, like the sound of his own breathing. The track led them back through the hornbeam coppice where he had inspected the stools earlier in the day, though now in the fading light the coppice looked different, the straight grey stems receding into the mist like the bars of a cage that went on forever, the spaces between them filling with a pale white fog that drifted slowly among the trees. The Verderer passed the dead hornbeam stool with its bracket fungi, the shelves of brown and cream now barely visible in the dimness, and he noted that the rain had filled the small pools on their upper surfaces until they overflowed in tiny waterfalls that dripped from one shelf to the next. He passed the leaning boundary post that he had straightened, and he saw that it was still upright, though the water had welled up again around its base and would need to be drained properly when the weather allowed. He passed the section of hazel coppice where the rods had been so straight and healthy, and he saw a woodcock rise from the undergrowth and fly away between the stems with its characteristic flickering flight, its long bill pointing downward, its wings making a soft whirring sound that faded quickly into the silence of the wood. The horse did not startle at the bird's flight, only flicked an ear and continued walking, and the Verderer watched the woodcock until it vanished into the mist, and then turned his gaze back to the track ahead. The forest was growing darker now, the grey of the sky above the canopy shifting from pewter to charcoal as the hidden sun sank somewhere beyond the cloud layer and the horizon. The mist that had been rising from the bracken now lay in thick banks across the track, swirling around the horse's legs and reaching up to the height of the Verderer's knees, so that the animal seemed to be wading through a slow river of vapour that moved with a gentle current only the mist itself understood. The Verderer pulled his cloak more tightly around him, the wool heavy with water and cold against his neck, and he felt the dampness that had seeped through the seams at his shoulders, a slow chill that had been working its way inward all day and was now a constant presence, like a hand laid lightly on his back. He did not shiver, did not hurry, only accepted the cold as part of the day's work and let the horse carry him forward through the gathering dusk. They came to the open meadow of Fairmead as the last of the grey light was draining from the sky, and the Verderer saw the great pollard oak standing alone in the centre of the clearing, like a dark island rising from a sea of mist. The mist here was deeper than in the wood, lying in a thick white blanket over the grass, so that only the topmost branches of the tree were visible, and the horse descended into it carefully, its legs disappearing into the white until it seemed to be walking on a cloud. The Verderer looked back over his shoulder and saw the track behind him, already filling with mist, the trees at the edge of the meadow fading into the grey like figures in a dream that dissolved as soon as you looked at them. He turned forward again and let the horse cross the meadow at its own pace, the animal's ears still pricked forward and its stride steady despite the strange half-light and the obscuring fog. As they neared the Fairmead tree, the Verderer could make out the dark mass of its trunk and the spreading crown of its pollard branches, each one outlined in droplets of water that caught what little light remained and held it in tiny points of silver brightness. The acorns that had been so thick under the tree earlier in the day were now hidden beneath the mist, but the Verderer heard the horse's hooves crunch softly on them as they passed beneath the canopy, a sound like walking on gravel that was muffled by the fog. He did not stop at the tree this time, only touched his hand to his hood in a small gesture that might have been a greeting or a farewell, and then they were past it, and the meadow was behind them, the great oak swallowed by the mist and the dark, until it was only a memory of a shape against the grey. The track led them now into the deeper wood where the ancient oaks stood, their massive trunks rising like pillars in a cathedral that had no roof but the sky, and the Verderer felt the change in the air as the mist thinned slightly under the denser canopy. The drip of water from the leaves was the only sound beyond the horse's hooves, a constant soft patter that fell from the high branches and landed on the leaf litter, with a sound like the footsteps of very small animals moving through the undergrowth. The Verderer passed the ancient yew that grew at the bend in the path, its dark mass even darker now against the darkening sky, and he inclined his head as he had done that morning, a habit so old and so ingrained that he did it without thinking. The yew stood silent and dripping, its red-brown bark glistening with wet, and then it was behind him, and the track curved on through the stands of oak and holly that led toward the outer boundary of the royal forest. The light was almost entirely gone now. The grey of the sky faded to a deep charcoal that was nearly black, and the forest around the Verderer was a world of shadows within shadows, the trees only visible as darker shapes against the slightly lighter background of the mist. The horse navigated by memory and by the feel of the track under its hooves, and the Verderer trusted the animal to find the way, giving it its head and letting the reins lie loose on its neck. He was tired, not exhausted, but ready for the warmth of the lodge and the bowl of broth that waited for him, and his thoughts had slowed to match the pace of the horse's walk, moving in a calm, unhurried stream that followed the track of the day's events without urgency or emotion. He thought of the deer herd he had counted, the 14 animals moving through the mist, and he thought of the fallen alder across the pale and the way the axe had bitten into the wet wood, and he thought of the forester's hut standing empty in its circle of holly. And all these thoughts flowed together into a single quiet current that carried him homeward through the dark. They came to the brook at the ford where the water still rushed over its bed of rounded stones, the sound of it louder now in the darkness and the mist. The horse paused at the water's edge, as it had done that morning, lowering its head to drink, and the Verderer let it, listening to the sound of the water and the soft swallowing sounds the animal made as it drew the cold stream into its mouth. The brook had risen slightly since the morning, the water now reaching higher on the bank, and small twigs and leaves still raced past on the surface, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. When the horse had drunk its fill, it lifted its head and stepped into the ford without being asked, the water splashing around its legs and soaking the Verderer's boots for the second time that day. The cold of the water was sharp but brief, and then they were across and climbing the far bank, the horse shaking its head once to clear the water from its ears before continuing on along the track. Ahead now, the Verderer could sense rather than see the approach of the outer gate, the wooden gate set between the 2 ancient oaks where he had dismounted that morning. The track narrowed and the trees pressed closer, and then the gate was there, a dark rectangle against the slightly paler darkness of the mist beyond. The horse stopped without being asked, and the Verderer dismounted for the last time that day, his legs feeling the solidity of the ground with a slight ache that came from long hours in the saddle. He walked to the gate and found the latch by touch, the wet wood rough and cold under his glove, and he lifted the carved peg from its socket, the wood still swollen with moisture, and resisting slightly before it came free. He pushed the gate open, and the leather hinges creaked their long, slow note into the silence of the evening, a sound that seemed to carry through the mist and echo from the trees before fading away. He led the horse through the gap, and then closed the gate behind them, fitting the latch back into its socket with a solid thump that was the last official action of his patrol. They were out of the royal forest now, on the track that led past the boundary stone and the pollarded oak, and then into the yard of the lodge at Chingford. The mist here was thinner, or perhaps the darkness was simply less complete, and the Verderer could make out the shape of the lodge roof against the sky, the thatch dark and heavy with the day's rain. The horse quickened its pace slightly, recognizing the nearness of its stable and its feed, and the Verderer let it, walking beside it now with one hand resting on its wet neck. They passed the boundary stone where the carved cross was still visible as a darker shape against the granite, and they passed the pollarded oak with its broken limb still hanging by a strip of bark, and then the yard opened before them, the mud and straw of the clearing glistening faintly in the last remaining light that came from somewhere, perhaps the clouds themselves reflecting the distant glow of a village fire. The Verderer led the horse into the lean-to stable and set about the familiar tasks of the evening, with the same deliberate care he had brought to every action of the day. He unbuckled the girth and lifted the saddle from the horse's back, feeling the warmth of the animal's body rising from the wet wool of the saddle blanket. He set the saddle on its rack and pulled the blanket free, hanging it over the rail to dry as much as it would in the damp air. He removed the bridle, slipping the bit gently from the horse's mouth, and the animal worked its jaw with a soft champing motion before lowering its head to the hay net that the verderer had refilled. He took a twist of dry straw from the stack in the corner and rubbed the horse down, working the straw over the wet coat with long, firm strokes that dried the worst of the moisture and fluffed up the thick winter hair. The horse stood patiently for this, its eyes half closed in the dimness, and when the verderer was finished he gave the animal a final pat on the shoulder and left it to its hay. He walked across the yard to the lodge and pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the single room that was now nearly dark, except for the faint glow of the banked hearth. He knelt and stirred the embers with a stick, adding a few pieces of dry kindling and a split log of hornbeam, blowing gently until the flame caught and filled the room with a warm orange light that pushed back the shadows and made the wet cloak hanging from its peg seem less like a drowned thing. He hung his own cloak on the peg beside the door, the wool so heavy with water that it dripped onto the clay floor in a slow, steady rhythm, and he sat on the stool to unwind the wet leggings from his calves, the wool cold and clinging and leaving red marks on his skin where it had been bound tight all day. The fire grew as the wood caught, and the verderer filled the iron pot with water from the bucket and set it on the trivet to warm. He took a clay bowl from the shelf and a wooden spoon from the crock beside the hearth, and he ladled out a portion of the broth that had been left from the previous day, a thick dark liquid of boiled beans and leeks and a few scraps of salt meat that smelled of the earth and the smokehouse. He ate slowly, sitting on the stool with the bowl in his hands, the warmth of the fire on his face and the warmth of the broth in his belly slowly driving out the chill that had settled into him during the long wet ride. The horse moved in the stable next door, and the verderer heard it, a soft thump of a hoof against the wooden partition, and he listened to the sound of the rain that had begun to fall more heavily again outside, pattering on the thatch and running in rivulets from the eaves. When he had finished his broth, he took the wax tablet from its pouch and set it on the shelf beside the door, the day's markings safely preserved and ready to be copied into the rolls when the chief forester made his next visit. He smoothed his hand over the closed boards, feeling the faint warmth of the wax inside, and then he banked the fire for the night, covering the embers with ash and a thick log that would burn slowly until morning. He lay down on the straw mattress and pulled the heavy woolen blanket over him, feeling the familiar lumps and hollows of the bedding settle around his body. The rain continued to fall on the thatch above him, and the mist continued to rise from the bracken in the forest beyond the yard. And the verderer closed his eyes and let the sounds of the wet autumn night wash over him, the dripping and the rustling and the distant rush of the brook all merging into a single quiet voice that told of the endless patient work of the forest. Somewhere out in the darkness the herds of fallow deer were bedding down in their sheltered places, the water was running in the ditches of the pale, and the wax tablet sat on its shelf with its small neat marks recording everything that had been seen and noted. The verderer's breathing slowed and deepened, and the lodge was silent except for the fall of the rain and the soft settling of the fire, and the royal forest of Waltham stood dark and quiet under the steady October sky.